Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Suprock. I'm Head of Solutions Architecture at Apex Covantage. Welcome very much to the meeting today. Liz already gave you the introduction associated with the title for the presentation, where we're going to be talking about automation inside of workflows that are designed to produce accessible products. For purposes with the distribution for the deck, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things before I get into the meat of the presentation. The first segment is I've included the abstract, so it's part of the deck that you'll receive. It makes it easy to be able to track and follow when you do receive the presentation. A little bit about Apex in terms of background, about why we're doing this sort of a talk here at DQ. Apex is a company that's been around for about 3 decades, providing a lot of content conversion services, and we have considerable experience and a worldwide footprint. Our range of activities in the sphere for technical aspects covers a broad number of technical groups of which we are members and have served positions in. We also have fairly active campaign group that provides information as far as resource and ability to be able to work with our customers and with other organizations. Finally, there's a broad range of topics in which we get involved. I'm going to focus on things that are associated with some book production today, and we'll bring in aspects about accessibility that touch on a large number of our services. The primary purpose for the session today is going to be focused on addressing how automation can improve accessible workflows, particularly with regard to the quality and the speed with which content can be delivered. I'm going to be touching on points associated with workflow design. I'm going to distinguish between born digital and remediation workflows. I'm going to focus on primary accessible targets for the deliveries, going to be EPUB 3 and PDF. I will touch on slightly about Microsoft Office products and the need to be able to understand the source that you're working with. I illustrate where there are going to be some automation points and provide you with some examples where those can be integrated into the workflow for success. And then talk about human intervention. That's still a necessary component to ensure that the high quality levels are desired and achieved with the products that we produce. The technical design philosophy here at Apex is important to understand. We have a philosophy that we need to have tools that are going to be driving our workflow processes. Our goal here is not to have everything be completely automated, but to maximize for our end users, our recipients, the quality of the material that comes into us. We try to be flexible with our workflow and utilize software where we can to achieve high velocity in the workflow so we get things in quick turnaround times. And we aim to be adaptable because we work with a broad range of different types of customers, ranging from large university libraries to publishers, to smaller organizations and commercial organizations. So our workflows need to be configurable along that. We don't have time to build software for every unique situation. So we build and borrow modules to be able to combine them together in order to be able to achieve the workflows that we've got. And our plan is to be extensible with those workflows. So we're going to add to them. Incorporated in our philosophy are a series of principles that I'll touch on as I go through the illustration with some of the points where we put in automation into our workflows. One is we have to know our source. So there's an analysis that takes place. The group I'm responsible for heading up at Apex Covantage, Solution Architecture, works closely with members on our sales team and our production team so that we have the ability to be able to understand what it is that our customers want. And that's key for anyone that's going to be delivering accessible products. You need to understand what the audience is. You need to understand who you're going to be delivering the materials to. And you need to be able to have a path that's going to allow you to achieve that in a cost-effective manner. So, the software pieces incorporated in our design, we try to make sure that we're following very objective rules for any kind of automation. What we're going to be doing is looking to use the software effectively to daisy chain together a fair number of tasks that could be run manually by running separate tools. But those are time consuming when you do that. And what we want to do is to focus the reporting from those tools so that they generate information about errors or items that could either be fixed through software itself or to be fixed with a human intervention or a human making a decision. Part of what we do in terms of developing our standards, particularly when we are looking at workflows for accessibility, is we're focusing on 3 different types of standards. The first of these that I've listed is an ANSI standard that is about statistical process control and being able to measure effectively what you have in a high volume workflow. The other 2 folks are familiar with that are attending this call, WCAG 2.1 and PDFUA, for the delivery of items that are accessible and meet industry standards. We do deal with bespoke requirements, so there is some variation that happens from time to time with the work that customers are requiring from us. And a key element that's involved in any kind of workflow process where you have automation and you have people integrating to be able to get to a good delivery point is to make sure that you have tiered evaluations that are set up. So you have to look at work that is in process. You have to look at products that are produced before they're ready for release. And you have to look at the end product before it gets released to a customer. So I'm going to focus on born digital workflows to be able to give you some examples and to highlight some points about where automation fits into the process. It's a workflow that many people are familiar with because of the usual publishing process. The classical prepress workflow involves having some word source that comes in, and you have typesetting, and then you have a delivery piece. So there are certain key steps that take place in that process. And those key steps to be able to support accessibility have as a key component, making sure that you're integrating elements that you need for accessibility. That means structuring documents and including things like alt text up front of getting to the point where you're going to render that material to a final delivery. And since source comes in from authors in a variety of different forms, one needs to find a mechanism to be able to standardize or normalize the content. There are 2 different types of XML systems that are in play at Apex. One we refer to as a non-robust XML typesetting system that would be in design, and it has the capability of processing XML, but it doesn't have a full range of features to be able to tighten and have very restrictive process control over how things can be handled within the InDesign documents as it is out of the box. So what we do is we make sure that we do add-ons associated with that to be able to tighten up the processing inside of InDesign. So we're dealing with things like hidden text that we don't want to see showing up in the print product. We want to make sure that there's query management and pass-through for those details. And a critical feature is to make sure that linking is maintained throughout the entire process. Automation is used quite heavily, and I'll show you some examples in the next slide, where we embed linking and we carry that through for the end products. And we have to make sure that that starts up front with the receipt of manuscript coming in. XML is key to all of this. So IDs and RIDs are important to be able to contain within all of the files as you move them through the system. And things like alt text need to be carried and maintained through, even from an editorial standpoint. And that harkens back to there being process changes when a document is born digital. There are editing phases that take place, there are proofs that are released. And in order to ensure that you have a document that on release from the typesetting system is going to be able to transform smoothly and quickly into an accessible product, you need to have constant validation that's occurring with the XML that's underneath in that system. Robust systems like XPP or 3v2 are highly processed, high XML processing systems. I'm not going to show examples for those, but they're available and can be used for the same kind of workflows sequencing. There are other presentations that have begun here at Axon that I think are quite good that have been covering template design and support for accessibility from that. As part of the system that I'm describing here, it is necessary to make sure that you have accessible templates in place and ready to go. So the first step in that process is to normalize or standardize your input source that's coming in. This is all geared toward modifying the source document. Since using Word as the example, it's to style and use paragraph and character styling to drive XML tagging that's going to be part of the parcel going through. Through this process, you can put in verifications and validations into the source document as you're manipulating it to be able to create a manuscript version that is structured that is following a hierarchical level of tagging for different heading levels to make sure that you have appropriate nesting that's going to be occurring within the document, and to make sure, as I mentioned before, cross-links are available and easily identifiable. Alt text can be added into the document during these very early stages in the process, and it's a great time to be able to insert alt text into the system, because you have an author that's involved during the manuscript and an editing stage as you move down the rest of the workflow process. The idea here is to be able to ensure that you've got a series of tools that are set up so that you're going to streamline the entire production process as you move from this point on. There are analogous procedures. We have different types of source, and one of those is LaTeX source, which requires some transformation to jump into an XML environment in many cases to be able to move forward quickly to get accessible files. Here's a pictorial example that illustrates some of the tools and the automation processing that goes on for being able to do a file prep to get proper word structuring started. To the right on this is a source diagram, and on the left is a resultant diagram that comes from this, where a series of styles have been applied through a template mechanism that's set up. Automation can be applied to this so that you are enabling operators to be able to select templates that are going to be vetted and approved for an accessible workflow, and then those get applied to a document for structured results. The ideal scenario in here is that templating takes place very quickly with the use of the tools that I'm showing on the screen. But there's a verification process to ensure that the template has been applied correctly with an operator parsing through it to be able to make any alterations or to find cases that may be needed to be updated with a revision to the software. That's part of the extensibility that I had described before in the software systems. Word file structuring, as you move on, includes the ability to be able to make intermediate files that include a series of different tags and ensure that there's preservation of alt text inside the document in a tagged manner, and something that's visible and can be easily checked as you're going through those initial phases of creating a structured document. And we've got verification tools that help with that process of styling, tagging, and making sure that you preserve any type of emphasis. Finally, we would then move through a phase where we're doing a visual rendering of that structured and styled and tagged document, which is much prettier for an author to be able to look at, much easier to read. And when the author has a chance to be able to do revisions after a copy editing phase, all of that content is still structured, tagged, and in the right manner that's available to generate XML going through the rest of the production process. I'm going to talk a little bit here about linking. It is very critically important to ensure that in the production workflow, we have tools that are set to be able to link tables and to link figures, to cross-references, to lists of tables, lists of references, and to do other linking like citations going to references. These are handled through a tool-based system that's going to structure through the, parse through the file and assist an operator for confirmation purposes that the item that's been identified by software is an appropriate link to embed in the tool. And therefore, we get IDs and RIDs that are going to be consistent and reliable moving into further stages of production. A lot of times we get references in from our customers that are structured according to a particular style, which is fairly easy then to be able to follow if we know what that is. But authors sometimes can be quite creative. And when authors come in with styles for references that don't necessarily follow that a standard style, for instance, a standard for Chicago Manual or for APA, we have software tools that are configured so that we can do proper structuring of those references, and so that we can create detailed tagging that's going to identify by parsing names, parts of the references, and so on. That's going to allow for further cross-reference linking and being able to generate URLs to be able to make reference to outside resources. These could be links that are then vetted against PubMed or vetted against Crossref or other entities to be able to create more extensible information associated with the references, and then the ability for an end user to have that as a value add with the content that they're receiving as an e-product, either PDF or an EPUB. The reference structuring and citation calling is illustrated in the next slide. We have software that will go through and auto parse references after we've queued it up with the reference structures we're expecting. So that's an acceleration process that we have. And what I show you in the other slide, for those of you that are able to see that, there's a color-coded breakdown that happens with those references so that each part of the reference is keyed up with a character styling that allows us to be able to create XML tagging that can be used in the generation of an end product. So in summary, we've started with the source, we've created a structured file, and we end up with a rendered file. That rendered file can actually include the images so that there is an opportunity for an author to be able to use that, as that author would be able to move forward in the entire production process. We have a process then where we export to an XML file from that. We have automation tools that allow us to be able to generate segments of the product, and then to be able to do composition and loading from that new typesetting environment. Showing you on this slide, automation with InDesign, being able to take in and auto process an XML file. The input file on top is XML. The output is being generated on the bottom, and you see the first page in that screen view. We do XML parsing and internal validation of the XML with added scripts that are embedded in the InDesign application, so that as edits are made, we're not going to lose links. We're not going to lose the structuring of the document. We're going to be able to preserve that even if an author is sending back to us a proof that needs to have modifications done to the document as a whole. This is critical to being able to ensure that you have output in a web PDF form or into an EPUB that's going to meet accessible criteria. Integrated to that process, and I go back to remind you about the 3-tier evaluation steps that we have. We automatically generate at different points in the workflow output using a variety of different tools to be able to gauge the quality of the work that's being produced. The delivery XML that we are put into this process at each stage is parsed. We do alt text differentiation with the captions that's included inside that XML. When we produce any PDFs that are coming out at each of these stages, we are using a variety of different types of checkers. I list 3 of them here: Adobe's Accessibility Checker, Vera PDF, and Apex's own PDF QA tool. We do a variety of different checks for EPUBs. We do the standard with EPUB check. We use Daisy Ace. We use a series of internal custom checkers. And we also follow rules associated with GCA certification from Benetech. And we evaluate image deliverable products against objective specifications. When we export to web PDF, it's always an automation process. This is all entirely software driven based on the XML that's there. We know we're going to get a good product because we've done internal validation up front, and then we do a validation on completion of that. Similar with auto processing to export XML. We can configure it out to export XML with different types of delivery formats because customers expect to have different types of components. And then we have tools to be able to do a configuration and select for what we need to deliver as EPUB 3 or MOBI files or XHTML, either as full books or in parts for customers. The slide I have up on the screen now is just simply an illustration that there is a cascading process that's involved here when you're generating an EPUB. And there's a validation process that takes place within the software system, and then the ability to be able to generate a series of different QA reports. Those QA reports are vetted at a couple of different levels inside of Apex. And I'm going to show you the output for a couple of those reports as we move into the next segment of this. The core software that we are using in our QA reports for output purposes are Vera PDF. We use PDF Tech as one of the tools, and I'll show you why that's a very good tool to use. We use sometimes the standard Acrobat outputs because customers are specifically requested that as an item to be able to meet. We use our own Apex XML analysis tools, and we use other QA tools that we are daisy chaining a series of tests together for. For those of you who aren't familiar with Vera PDF, it's PDF diagnostic tool that allows you to be able to analyze a accessible PDF file and determine whether it's meeting all the criteria for PDF UA, that specification. And what's shown up on the screen is an example of the XML export. It's a very good tool because it identifies for you the specific rules that have been tested, what has not passed or passed associated with those rules, and it provides you instance locations that you can reference. Utilizing the software to be able, with those instant locations, allows you to reference where that is inside the document to be able to make corrections or fixes, and then do a re-export to get to the corrected output proper file. PDFTK, I mentioned, is useful because of one feature that it has that's quite powerful, and that's the ability to be able to export bookmarks from the PDF. We utilize our software systems to be able to auto-generate bookmarks for all of the products that we end up producing. And this allows you to be able to verify the bookmarks are included in all the proper order. If there is any problem associated with spelling or other issue, it can be caught within this and then can be corrected as you move downstream in the workflow before delivery. This is particularly important and has been valuable in some of the remediation projects that we've used. Most folks are familiar with the Adobe PDF checklist and the checker for quality. It's a good report, but it doesn't cover some of the detailed things that we had listed with Vera PDF and some of the others. But it may be quite adequate for your customers' end use. Our XML analysis goes in and does a deep breath. What we do in the XML analysis is that we take our accessible PDFs and we export them to XML. And it's a highly rich XML. We're exporting content where we can identify language tagging, span tagging that's been included inside of the document or has been missed in a document. We're able to verify all of the inclusions for alt text and other attributes, other objects inside of the PDF file, and therefore be able, if we find a problem, to correlate back and locate that for making changes, making adjustments in the deliverable file. And our QA suite tool daisy chains a number of things together. The example that I have up on the screen is that we customize this associated with each job. We're able to go through and identify a variety of different things. This particular example that I have starts with the case where it's reporting that the output file is exceeding the recommended maximum file size that a customer has requested. That may lead to some other changes that we need to make, and a human needs to make that decision. So it's flagging that up in the process. It's also going through and providing a series of warnings that are not necessarily errors, but they may not be following a particular standard that we have applied here. And we need to check that and confirm that it's acceptable against the specs for the job. This also is a good case for an example point because it's checking an EPUB as one of the outputs in this delivery process. And it's showing in the first instance that size check was about a PDF file. This is a daisy chain of a series of different products that are output at the same time and then evaluated for accessibility purposes. It does EPUB check for the EPUB, and then it starts running into the daisy ace checker, and it integrates all of those feedback points in one pass. So by having these tools available at the three different tiers, at the end of production, before we move into our formal QA process, we already have the evaluations that the production team can execute and then do alterations and changes for. I had mentioned to you that Apex does a broad variety of different types of work. I'm going to just have one slide here for you about what we do in terms of our conversion workflows, where we're starting with either PDF or image source that's coming into us. Large national libraries have these types of sources. And our ISAC system is the primary tool that we use for this. It is a software system that allows us to be able to disaggregate the content that is found within a publication or a series of publications, meaning that we go into a page, we're able to isolate what's text, what's tables, what's math, what's images, and so on, and split it into those individual components. Inside the workflow, we can add alt text, we can add other types of descriptors, we can make sure that we have identified styling and hierarchy associated with the objects that we have created, And then our delivery software in one pass will generate whatever the delivery outputs are necessary. So we've had instances where you've produced up to 5 or 6 different types of deliverables from a single pass through. The types of quality checks that I had shown you with the PDF QA tool is integrated into our ISAC workflow with the delivery outputs. Every delivery is including a series of validations. Those validations are going to generate warnings and flags and will point us to being able to go back to address a specific component associated with the workflow. If there were errors and only elements that were associated with how the math was generated and how that would be impacting having alt text associated with math that would be embedded into the output files, then it's only the math portion of that we would go back and do correction in this and have everything else available in the system to do our exports for. So you see between what I had just described for the ISAC system and what we do for our prepress workflows, there's different thinking that has to be put in place, but there are some common threads when it comes to accessibility and the workflow process. It's making sure that we integrate those accessible tools into the workflow and are able to do quality checks as we're producing the products to get to a good end result. For the last few minutes, I'm going to touch on several items that are associated with remediation of files. Remediation of documents is something that Apex has been involved in for the last several years. And it's a different animal entirely from doing the born digital type of work. Remediation of PDF documents comes from publishers and it comes from commercial sources for the work that we perform. We do have automation tools that we integrate into the workflow process, but it's not as tightly controlled with us being able to manage the source that we get in quite clearly. So we have to do an understanding of issues. Quite frequently, that means we're running our validation tools against the source that we receive in order to identify the problems that we need to be able to fix. That's a little bit different than what we do in the born digital workflows, where we're responsible and we have structured processes going to generate high quality files before we get to the point that we have to run those tools. We need to understand what the issues are inside the document, what's missing, what's wrong, in order to be able to do fixes to those documents. Those fixes quite frequently involve having some form of manual intervention with the document. We aren't allowed to just always repurpose the document and come up with a new output, although that sometimes is something that is a last resort and we work with our customers on. We utilize Acrobat for doing a number of fixes. We use the XSPDF Quick Fix product. We use Pitstop Pro. These are the primary tools. We do have a variety of others that we have integrated that are bespoke tools into our process for identifying where problems are and being able to do the output. Those QA tools that I had shown you before and some of the output are automatically invoked whenever we have completed the work inside these other tools, so that we get reports out that allow us to be able to verify that we've made the correct fixes in the proper location. All of this helps us with not having, as some folks probably when you first get started doing remediation or you've been introduced to using Acrobat for remediation, it prevents you from having to sit there through Acrobat panels and then navigate through the internals of a PDF file trying to figure out what you need to be able to tag or to modify inside that document. There are some things that we can't fix inside of PDF documents when we receive them. The biggest types of problems that we have seen associated with older PDF files are that some typesetting systems, and old 3B2 systems were notorious for this, would produce hybrids from their content during the production process. Not only did those hybrids contain instances where there would be text that would be merged in with images, so some portion of the text would be converted into an image, particularly happened with drop caps and some other characters. And there would be other cases where 3B2 would do a font obfuscation thing where they were creating their own types of fonts. Not only were they difficult to be able to match up, not all of them were Unicode fonts. So in cases like that, sometimes you have to go back and talk with the customer and say, after we've done our initial analysis, we've identified here are types of issues or problems. If you want to have this document remediated in a fully accessible form, you'll need to go back and do a different type of conversion process. We can preserve the same visual appearance to that document as it was in the original source if we go to an image over text PDF, and then all the accessibility tagging and requirements would be met with the content that's underneath of that image. And as I mentioned, we're using a very similar set of QA tools as the conversion workflows when we're doing our checks for PDF remediation. Another category of tools that we have done remediation work for in workflows where we have gone back to the same suite of QA tools for our practices and been able to do some modification to a few of those has been working with Microsoft Office documents. There is a strong reliance in working with Microsoft Office documents to be able to utilize the Office tools that Microsoft has supplied for verifying that you have alt text, that things have been tagged in a proper order. And those work fine within the Office documents themselves. Converting Office documents from that point into PDF and ensuring that the PDF is going to be structured requires a two-step process. And that is something that can be done, but it's something that you should be aware of. It's not a perfect, once you get an accessible Office document passing Microsoft Tools tests, you can't just automatically assume that it's going to pass every test going into a PDF form of that document. The primary issues that we've seen associated with these documents deal with styling in them. And there are many instances where folks utilizing Word documents have gone through and inserted extra spaces that are in by the simple mechanism of typing in an extra paragraph that's completely empty, or doing other types of manipulations or modifications to the files that are creating a suite of styles that may end up disrupting what would be the hierarchy in the heading level tagging. In some of those cases, it's very difficult to be able to preserve the layout when you go through to correct everything to make the document accessible. In some instances, that can be extremely difficult to do, and you may have to resort to recomposing or getting permission to allow the document to reflow to become accessible. So there are different criteria that you need to be able to settle on with your customers to reach an appropriate endpoint. Again, non-Unicode fonts will leak their way into some of these documents, and it's necessary to be able to make changes with those. In the case of we're having non-Unicode fonts that are replicating, say, old characters, there are several foreign language font sets that are out there that are still non-Unicode. They have a look and feel that the author wants to preserve because it's necessary for historical purposes, but they may not work in an accessible document going forward. So those need to be looked at and changed and may be suitable for retaining that look and feel by going to something like an image over text PDF and allowing accessibility to take place. But for those people who have no issues being able to see that image content, they would be able to carry forward with the rendering process. And then lastly, we do get into doing EPUB remediation, although it doesn't happen as often as the other two. These are almost always publisher source. They're almost always the case that a publisher would like to get to having an accessible EPUB. And what they've got is a collection of things that were produced in the early days of generating EPUBs. Many cases of this, we will use our automation tools in the Isaac workflow to do a conversion. So we're going to be ingesting the EPUBs. But the difficulty comes in old EPUBs in making sure that they are tagged in a consistent manner that's going to be able to bring them up to the EPUB 3 specification, and that the HTML has been properly structured to be able to report the associated, generate the appropriate heading levels and nesting that you need in an accessible EPUB 3 that's going to meet GCA standards. In some instances, we've seen EPUBs that are quite simply flat documents that are just nothing but a series of paragraphs. There is no styling or semantic information that's present there. One almost needs to read the content in order to be able to translate these into the appropriate levels for styling purposes. So in those instances, sometimes it's much more cost effective to start over And you get a copy of the document that was in PDF form and then work that through a conversion process to be able to get out a valid EPUB 3. The same kinds of rules apply in this when you're working with those old EPUBs where there are elements that cannot be fixed without recomposing some segments. There are many cases where text has been incorporated as images. There are many instances where tables have been incorporated as images, and equations quite frequently are incorporated as images. The QA for all EPUBs that are produced here is an automated process that invokes the DAISY ACE checker. It invokes EPUB check, and it invokes tests that we put in following GCA guidelines as a GCA certified vendor. So in summary, the outcomes for this session that I wanted to be able to touch on today were to show you points where automation can improve accessible workflow products. This is most strongly by enforcing process discipline in the workflow and by enforcing very rapid QA that points out where there are errors or problems, doesn't give you a laundry list of things that have passed, and allows there to be focus with the operators or anyone else who needs to be able to make a decision about what the outcome or modification should be for that document. The QA tests that are put in via these mechanisms are highly objective. So it's easy to set rules and define rules for those. The workflow design principles that I talked about need to be carried through from start to finish if you're going to achieve the highest or fastest turnaround time for delivering your files. And you need to be able to make sure that incorporated in those workflow design principles that you have tight integration between the different teams that are going to be executing them. That means solutions architecture, that means production, that means your software teams. Born digital and remediation workflows require different thinking and different training, but they all are based upon, when producing accessible files, understanding what the accessible targets are that you need to be able to hit for your customer, and understanding what the source is for the content that you're going to be producing. We talked about EPUB 3 and PDF targets, and we talked about different types of source that would be coming in and understanding what is involved in those contents and how you can drive it to get to a structured form. Almost always in this, you're going to require some human intervention. And I think it's a wise precaution to be able to give consideration when you're designing workflows and you're considering what you need to do, that you have to start up front. And it involves people to have conversations about how to be able to best achieve accessibility. You're going to start very early at the design process. It's going to be heavily involved with human intervention and decision making at that point. And as you move forward through the workflow process, the amount of automation that you can put in and the speed with which you can deliver files is tightly correlated with what the output quality needs to be for that content. The higher the quality level or higher the quality expectations, the more frequently you need to be able to put in people to make final decisions associated with that. It's a conservative kind of approach if you think about it. We can put in and have experimented with utilizing machine learning and AI types of tools, but there is a conservative process with having a human make a decision if something needs to be changed associated with alt text, or if you need to be able to consider how to properly restructure a certain segment of a file. Those elements are very, very important because in order to maintain accessibility, you need to make sure that humans are able to recognize the content and the nature of the files that are being delivered. That's it. Thank you very much for your time today. I did a bit of a whirlwind tour of different types of aspects associated with our workflows. I'm Greg Suprock, Head of Solutions Architecture at Apex Covantage, and look forward to talking with you and taking any kind of questions that may come up from the presentation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg, for that great session. We do have quite a few questions in here, so I'm just going to dive right in if that's good with you.
Sure.
Okay. For those of you who haven't posted questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. You can also use the upvote feature for the questions that you want Greg to answer the most. Okay, so when creating an accessible EPUB, are you always starting with a Word document and creating an XML document as opposed to using HTML?
It depends upon the workflow that we are engaged in. In the prepress example that I had shown you, we drive to getting XML because we very frequently have to make a delivery that is multi-pronged. We need to make a web PDF deliverable. We need to make a print PDF deliverable. We have to create XML that may be an archival tool that is utilized by our publishers. And we have to make an EPUB. So in those instances, we are driving to XML first. It is not necessary for us to be able to stick to generating XML as the only path forward, but it's quite flexible, and it's very easy to be able to structure and to be able to control tightly the process underneath. In our ISAC workflow, I mentioned it's a modular process. So if we're starting with page images or we're starting with a legacy PDF, that type of content, it isn't necessary for us to be able to output XML in the intermediate phases because we're creating separate components that are going into our database for each of those objects. Then from there, we can generate simply XHTML that's going to go into an EPUB creation rather than have to go to an XML deliverable at all.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next question here. Okay, this one is on large batch PDF production flows. Okay, when working with large batch PDF production flows, what is the best method to add PDF reading order tags when using a template and large complex tables?
Okay, it depends again on the workflow.
Mm-hmm.
If it is a large batch that is going through our ISAC system, then we have a structured process. We're going to be disaggregating the content, and then we would be identifying reading order as we are going through that process. That's highly effective and highly efficient. If you're doing a remediation project and you have large batch PDFs, one of the things that we can do in that process is to be able to do certain key mappings that are set up. So it's almost an ISAC-like tool to be able to identify where you have heading levels and structures inside of the document. And then from there, you're able to generate bookmarks and be able to correlate that those bookmarks are following in the appropriate order as you're looking at the content. I had showed you the XML export tool that we utilize for our PDFs. We're able to use that as a verification tool to be able to map out and ensure that content is falling in the appropriate reading order. So by utilizing different tools to be able to look at the internals for the PDF and then export out those tools, we then have documents that we can compare and parse against one another to be able to get to the appropriate endpoints quickly. There are still decision points where you need to have humans involved to do the verification on that, but the computer assist does help with the speed of the processing.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. All right. When you have various versions of accessible deliverables, for example, EPUB and PDF, what is the purpose for having them and how different is the output?
Sure. When we have different deliverables, it's usually because we have a publishing customer that is interested in multi-channel distribution. So they want to have an EPUB that's available for distributing to Apple. They want to have one that's going to be sent to Amazon for conversion into an Amazon deliverable. They want to have web PDF that may be available for download because folks aren't comfortable with looking at a reflowable EPUB for that content. They're much more comfortable seeing something that is representative of the print product that they would also have. That's quite common in many university or academic settings. So ensuring that we have those different deliverable channels available and having it come through a system where we're starting from a common component and then spitting out those different components ensures that they have the same content, are tagged in the same manner, and are equally as accessible.
Great. All right. Will EPUB replace PDF soon?
People have been talking about online replacing print for years too.
Yeah.
It's still an ongoing thing. I think that EPUB is quite powerful from the standpoint of an accessible document format. I believe that it is much better in many instances for folks who have visual disabilities and being able to view the content. So I think it is a very strong candidate for carrying forward.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a generational type of thing. I think there will be a progression that will occur where more and more people will be used to utilizing reflowable EPUB and comfortable with that. But there are still going to be folks that learn well by reading books.
Right.
And that's going to go back to the PDF format.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions here. Sure. Do you have the same humans intervening when needed throughout the process, or is the flow set up where familiarity to the content is not needed?
That's a very good question. We have subject matter experts that will be involved at points where it's necessary to have subject matter experts. But in cases where that subject matter expert needs to be someone who understands XML coding and hierarchy, there's different class of person that is working that. So the answer to the question is we have different people at different stages in the workflow that are trained and qualified to be able to execute on those tasks. Mm-hmm. It does build familiarity. The overall goal for us is to make sure that we have people that are broadly trained in our organization so they can execute multiple tasks and they understand what their role is associated with the product that they're producing.
Right. Thank you for that. Do you ever use fixed layout EPUBs?
We do on very rare occasion create fixed layout EPUBs. What we have found with most of our publisher customers is that they much prefer to just go to an accessible web PDF than to utilize the fixed layout EPUB. And that's been quite a common thread. I would say probably 5 or 6 years ago, there were many more cases where we were requested to produce fixed layout EPUBs than what we are seeing today.
All right, so I think we're going to just do one more question. Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for these great questions. All right, what is the #1 way someone new to accessibility can make a substantial difference?
What's the #1 way?
Yeah.
I think the #1 way that a person who is new to accessibility can make a substantial difference is to get involved with groups like participating at this conference, by getting involved with standards groups, by making sure that you get involved in professional societies or organizations. I had listed some of the organizations that Apex is involved in. Right. Society for Scholarly Publishing, very good place for a person that's involved and interested in accessibility to be able to connect more with people who are of like mind. And it's an influential community within the publishing sector. Getting involved from your organization with outfits like NISA allows you to participate in helping to define what the standards are going to be as you move forward in time. It's also a great environment to be able to learn about the standards and be able to have an influence, participate on committees that are helping to evaluate what those upcoming standards are going to be.
Awesome. And with that, I think we are about at time here. I do want to thank you, Greg, for such a great session. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I believe this is the last session of today, but there is a whole day tomorrow at AXCON that will be jam-packed with more information. So we hope to see you there and hope you enjoy the rest of AXCON, everyone. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Liz.